Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I have the pleasure of discussing with you one of the great structures of all time in the body. It's part of the kidney, it's part of the urinary system, and it's basically the functional unit of the kidney. It's called the nephron. And so let's get into that conversation. Coming in, you might be like, okay, so the urinary system, it's pretty important. I understand, produces urine. It's stored in the urinary bladder. The main function of the kidney when blood comes down the abdominal aorta and goes through the renal arteries and into the kidney is that it filters metabolic wastes from the kidney, and it forms urine. And then that urine travels down those two ureters right there, and it's stored in the urinary bladder and then out the urethra. And you're like, sure, I've got it. And there's a few other functions that are really critical for the kidney too. It produces hormone, which influences red blood cell production. It produces a enzyme that helps to regulate pH. Does all sorts of things. And ultimately, it controls pH and it controls the volume and composition of the blood, maintaining homeostasis. But this particular video is going to emphasize just the anatomy and structure of these functional microscopic units called nephrons, which are inside the kidney. And why is that? Why not get into the physiology of it? Well, I'm going to make a separate video on the creation of urine or the function of the nephron, simply in order to maintain such a complex topic and make it more reasonable to sort of handle. And so let's get into that. So again, it's all about the blood coming down from the heart and the aorta, and under extremely high pressure, it's entering into both kidneys. And so the blood then, if I can start illustrating this, the blood then branches off into smaller arteries, and then smaller arteries, and then still smaller arteries, and then eventually it'll reach these nephrons. And these nephrons are found in the cortex, which is this outer region of the kidney, but they also loop down into the medulla as well. But basically what I'll say is that the nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and it's what helps to produce the urine, and it helps to produce renin, and it helps to do all these things. And so the nephron is pretty critical. And so here's a cross-section of the kidney. And so I was mentioning the middle area of the kidney is known as the medulla. Okay, so that's what you got, these sort of renal, which means kidney, renal pyramids right here making up the medulla. And then sort of this funnel-like structure is known as the renal pelvis. This ultimately is going to be where urine is going to be traveling down these collecting ducts and then entering, there's a lot of them, and entering this funnel-like structure of calyces, and then ultimately traveling down the ureter toward the urinary bladder. So urine is being produced by the kidney, and it's being produced in the nephron. And so where are these nephrons, and what do they look like? Well, they're found in part up here in the cortex, which is this outer region right here, this cortex. So part of the nephron is located here, and then it extends a little bit down into the medulla. So part of it is in the cortex, part of it is in the medulla. This is obviously not what the nephron looks like, but I'm just giving you a bigger idea that there's nephrons up here. And this is where they're located in the kidney, the nephrons. You're like, wow, there's probably a lot of them. Well, it's an estimation, but we believe that there's about 1 million nephrons per kidney. So they're really small, and they're very important. And so here's a little bit better of a diagram. And so here's your renal pelvis. Here's the renal artery bringing blood in. Here's the renal vein taking deoxygenated blood out that has been filtered. The renal pelvis, again, travels urine down the ureter. So if you look up here, you'll notice that the kidney is made up of two parts. There's this outer region called the renal cortex, and then this middle area, which is the renal medulla. Okay, but then if you blow that up and look at the cortex out here and the renal medulla here, you'll notice that this yellowish structure is what we're calling the nephron. Okay, and so what's fascinating, I'll get into the detail of the anatomy in a moment, but this is what I mean about it. It's starting off in the cortex and extending itself down into the medulla, and then it comes back. But then ultimately, these tubes called collecting ducts will lead the urine, let me go yellow, will lead the urine down the collecting ducts right here, and there's many of them, these collecting ducts that come down, and it actually gives this sort of striated appearance here in the renal pelvis. And it's like in the renal medulla, in the renal pyramid, in the renal medulla. And where is all that urine going? It's traveling in this tube. It first starts off as a minor calyx, and then major ones, and then ultimately into the renal pelvis. So urine is traveling down like this. Urine is traveling down from this collecting duct. That's what I'm drawing in right there, the collecting duct. So I'll just do that, collecting tube, and then into a collecting duct. Okay? So let's look at the nephron in general. And so there's diagrams that I'm about to show you in a moment of better than perhaps I can draw of the nephron, because it's kind of complicated, but I just wanted to go a little bit slowly on this so you can get an appreciation of it. So the nephron is composed of something called a renal tubule. So in other words, it's a kidney tube. That's all it means, the tubule. And what's interesting is it's made of this, like this. It looks like this. And I'm drawing it in just like 2 dimensions. It's this capsule. Okay, so I'm going to do this. And it has a couple of names. It was first identified by a gentleman called Bowman. And so it's sometimes referred to as the Bowman's capsule. Capsule. Okay, the Bowman's capsule. But in fact, it's difficult to draw this because what you're really talking about here in this capsule is something, if I could make this analogy, something that looks a little bit like a fishbowl. So it's circular and it's 3-dimensional and goes all the way around. So a fishbowl, and it's coming out. That doesn't look like a fishbowl to me. And so this is what we're drawing as the renal tubule right now. So and the tube's going to extend down right here. Okay. But there's also a blood vessels involved, and you're like, well, obviously, because blood vessels are what's bringing the blood to the nephron. And so, as I mentioned before, it was a renal artery, and then it branches further and further into these smaller arterioles. But ultimately, when we reach the nephron itself, the major arterial that's bringing in blood to the nephron is referred to as the afferent, meaning to bring in afferent arterial. Let's see, I'm going to spell that arterial right, okay? Afferent arterial. And the arterial is bringing it in, and then ultimately this is going to, as you would imagine, branch off into a capillary network. Now there's all kinds of capillaries in here, so many that it actually forms like a network. It's almost like a ball-like structure, a tuft of capillaries. And you would expect that because any exchange of fluid out of the circulatory system is going to have to happen at a capillary level. And so these capillaries are called, the cool name, glomerulus. Glomerulus. Okay, so it's a tuft of capillaries called the glomerulus. That's right. And so the blood's raging in here under high pressure. So I'm going to try very hard not to get into the functionality. I'm tempted to do so, but I'm going to try to just look at the anatomy, if that's okay, for this particular video. And then the blood exits. And this is kind of unusual. I just want to point it out. Just unusual. Usually, if you're familiar with the circulatory system, you're like, yeah, I get it. It goes from artery, at least in the systemic circuit, it goes from an artery away from the heart into a smaller arterial, and then into capillaries where there's gas exchange. And then, of course, it returns to the heart via a venule and then a vein. But in this case, unusual, it goes from an arterial to a capillary to another arterial. And this arterial that it exits is literally called efferent, for exit, efferent, arterial. And there's some cool things that I'm tempted to get into, but I won't at the moment, but I'll just say that it's a smaller arterial, which tends to create a little bit more pressure in the glomerulus, which helps, here I go, filter the blood. And that's one of the functions of the glomerulus, to filter the blood. And so, sorry, I'm revealing it, but I can't help it. But the liquid plasma is going to be exiting right here and going into the renal tubule. And so here's the thing. In the Bowman's capsule will then continue with the renal tubule, but it becomes very, very convoluted. And so it's kind of windy like this, sort of like a labyrinth maze. And the convolutions are in 3 dimensions, and so I can't draw that very easily in 3 dimensions, but it's very convoluted, and it's very close to the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. So collectively, this whole region right here is known as the renal corpuscle, right in here, this filtering area. But since it's very close to the glomerulus, this twisty, convoluted part of the renal tubule is known as the proximal, because it's proximate, or close to, the proximal convoluted, how's that, convoluted renal tubule. Okay. Now, what's interesting is it winds all around, and you're like wondering, well, I wonder what that's all about. Well, there's a lot of surface area for what the function is of the proximal renal tubule, which is to reabsorb things from the filtrate back into the blood that the kidney doesn't want to release. But I'll get into that in a separate video. And then the renal tubule goes really, 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 really far down. It loops really far down. And there was an individual the first to describe that. His name was Henle. And so we give it up for him. We can just call it the renal loop, but we can give it a specific name called the loop of Henle. And so we'll just do that, the loop of Henle. And so there's a descending loop and a ascending loop. And then what's interesting is the tube then becomes convoluted again. And so since this is a little bit further away from the renal corpuscle, although it does get very close to the glomerulus, is called the distal convoluted tubule, the distal. And then that segues around like this into what's called a collecting duct. And what's interesting is that's sort of like, at this point, with the fluid that's inside of this is the creation of urine. And so ultimately, this collecting duct is going to enter into collecting tubes, and then down the renal pyramids, and then into the calyces, and then out the ureters. The thing is, it's kind of like a trash chute from different nephrons, and so you can have different branches coming off. You can have multiple nephrons coming off this collecting tube right here. So that's kind of interesting. So you get nephron, sort of branches of a tree. And then this ultimately is leading out, this collecting tube. Okay, so what about this peritubular capillary network? And so I'm going to have to resort to a picture for this one. So here is, the yellow is showing the renal tubule. Okay, so this is right here, the afferent blood vessel, the afferent arterial, which is bringing blood in. So the blood's cruising in like this, and it goes through the glomerulus, and it comes out the efferent arterial right there. So that's blood. Now, what's shown in yellow is the renal tubule. So let me sort of identify this. So here is the Bowman's capsule. This tube right over here is the proximal convoluted renal tubule, and it's very windy here, three-dimensional. This is the loop of Henle right here. And what's interesting, many things, what's interesting about the loop of Henle and also the collecting duct right here is that if you were to look at, I had mentioned this before, it actually transects the border between what is the renal cortex and the renal medulla. And this is going to be significant because the point of this, when we get into the physiology of this and we get into how urine is actually formed, is that this medulla area is going to be very, very, very salty. And so that's going to help in water reabsorption. And so we'll get into that. It's pretty interesting. But this is the loop of Henle. This is the descending loop. This is the ascending loop. And then once you get up here, you'll notice that we're going to call this, since it's convoluted, we're going to call it the distal convoluted tubule right here. And then this is the collecting duct, and these branches show that the possibility of different nephrons being there. You also may notice that there's sort of a thinness in the loop of Henle right in this loop right over here, especially towards the very bottom of the loop of Henle. I just want to point that out. It gets very thin, and that's actually kind of important when it gets into how water diffuses out of the renal tubule back into the bloodstream. And so how does it go back into the bloodstream? Well, if this is an arterial and this is capillary and this is an arterial, eventually we go back to capillary. So this is a small vessel. And so the capillaries loop around like this. They loop around, and so they're referred to as peritubular. Peritubular meaning around the tube. And of course, they're not going to be completely red always because they're going to lose oxygen. So they eventually will become blue and then reach a venule and then a larger vein, and then the renal vein will take the blood out of the kidney. So this is the peritubular capillary network. What's the significance of it? Oh, it's huge. It's all the fluid that's in the renal tubule that the body wants to keep is then reabsorbed back into the bloodstream in these capillaries. So this is all about reabsorption. And then anything that is not wanted is then removed through the collecting duct. Okay, so again, better drawing. This is the afferent arterial bringing blood in. So this is unfiltered blood. And you're like, well, what do we need to filter out? We might want to filter out some metabolic waste, such as these small nitrogen-containing compounds like urea. And so all of this comes cruising in, and it goes into this ball of capillaries called the glomerulus. And this is where filtration takes place into this capsule that's all the way around. But if it was shown all the way around, you wouldn't be able to see the glomerulus. And so I mentioned it being called the Bowman's capsule. Sometimes it's simply called the glomerular capsule. And this is where filtration takes place. And so the thing is, filtration sometimes implies that you're filtering out all the bad and keeping the good. In this case, filtration is not very specific. It's only small things are leaving the bloodstream. Things like red blood cells come in, they come out. White blood cells come in, come out. Proteins come in, come out. So all the small stuff is going into the renal tubule, which is called the glomerular filtrate. Sorry about discussing here. I can't stop myself discussing a little the physiology. So filtration takes place here. But the small stuff is not all bad. It's like water needs to be reabsorbed back into the blood. Glucose needs to be reabsorbed. Amino acids need to be reabsorbed. And so reabsorption takes place better when the tube is more convoluted. This is sort of like zooming right out. But if it's all twisty, you can get better reabsorption back into the peritubular capillary network. And then anything that we don't want is going to be urinated out ultimately. So this is a simplification of what the nephron really looks like. But it's kind of cool because it illustrates the three functions: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. Okay, so that's kind of cool. And so I like this picture a lot. It looks busy. It is, but I like it. And so let me just go here. The afferent, in other words, the blood vessel taking blood away from the glomerulus, gives rise to the peritubular capillary network. And it's called peritubular because guess what? It surrounds the tube. And then again, it's red because it's oxygenated, and then purple because oxygen is diffusing, and then it's blue, and then it returns ultimately to the renal vein. So that's what the blood vessels are all about, is reabsorbing the good stuff. So you go, let's talk about renal tubule. We go from the Bowman's capsule to the proximal convoluted renal tubule. This is a better drawing. You can see how convoluted it really is. And then it goes down here in the descending loop of Henle, and then the ascending. And again, I want to emphasize how there's a thickness over here and a thinness down here on the bottom. And then I also want to emphasize something that's already like here, is that the upper region, in other words, the convoluted proximal and distal tubes and the glomerulus, are located in the renal cortex, but the loop dips down into the medulla, and so does the collecting duct reach down into the medulla. That's important. And then ultimately, the reason that those pyramids looked somewhat striated is because of all these collecting ducts, which are heading in a downward direction from many different nephrons. Hopefully that's making sense. So what I was just drawing was this. In other words, all of these collecting ducts right here are coming down, bringing the urine, which is coming down here. Ultimately, the urine is traveling down sort of like these pipes that are ultimately going to come into the renal pelvis right over here, and then down the ureter and be stored in the bladder. But the nephron itself is again partially up here in the cortex, partially in the medulla. All right, so here's the glomerulus where the blood is filtered. The renal tubule is where there's reabsorption of materials from the tubule back into the bloodstream, and then anything unwanted is secreted to the outside. And so finally, the renal tubule leads from the Bowman's capsule. First, it's highly convoluted, which is the proximal convoluted tubule, and then it leads to the loop of Henle, and then finally the distal convoluted tubule, and then down the collecting duct. And so there's several collecting tubules that branch off, making one big collecting duct, which then leads again to the ureter and then the bladder. So this concludes this discussion of the basic anatomy, and slipped in a little physiology, basic anatomy of the nephron and urine function. But hopefully you'll stay tuned for a separate video on urine function. I'll talk a little bit more about the awesomeness that is the nephron and how it actually reabsorbs and secretes and filters all those cool things. So thanks for watching.